You know, it's always fun to go out to eat, and if you're particularly hungry, the temptation of going out to eat, of course, is to get an appetizer, and then maybe you order a big meal, maybe you pre-order a dessert, a piece of pie or something, or ice cream, or sundae. You get something more to drink than maybe just water as well, and because when we're hungry, we tend not to make rational decisions. We tend not to make choices based upon facts. We let our appetites decide, and so we just indulge, and our immediate needs are satisfied, and we feel better, and the hunger is gone, and all is well, and we can just sort of sit there and relax with pleasant company of friends around us, and all is good. But then the bill comes due, and the bill is, well, it's high. It's much higher than we thought it was going to be, and because we're now stuffed, we can't remember why we had to order so much food. What was all the fuss about there? But now we have to pay for our previous indulgences. Well, what happens when the bill comes due on bad decisions and it's simply more than we want to pay? The hard part about most bad decisions is that we don't realize they're a bad decision usually when we are making them. We don't realize they're bad until it is too late. And this sermon is not about avoiding those initial bad choices. Let's just make the assumption that we all have those in life. We all have those moments that if we could hop in the DeLorean and turn on the flux capacitor and get to 88 miles an hour, we would undo a few things. But because God has a covenant with us, because we are caught up inescapably in His love, we don't need to undo anything because Jesus is always doing something for us. So the sermon this morning is about how does Jesus redeem those bad decisions? How does He protect us from the worst of their consequences? And how do we not get in the way when He is doing that in our life? And Abraham's story gives us a great lesson in this. If you've been following this sermon series or you just know the story, you know that Abraham and Sarah were promised a child by God. I mean, they weren't just promised one child, but they were promised that they would have descendants as multitudinous as the stars in the heavens. But as they grew older, into their 70s and their 80s, and they've been waiting on God for a long time to give them a son, they took matters into their own hands. And Sarah said to her slave Hagar, "You shall be a wife for my husband. He will have a child through you." And she conceived, and his name was Ishmael. And the reading today is the story of that bill coming due. When Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was in her 90s, Genesis teaches us that the Lord visited her, and she had as He promised He would do, and she had a son, and his name was Isaac. And this, of course, was an occasion of great joy. And Sarah, who just a year ago had laughed at the thought of her having a child at her advanced age, was laughing for another reason entirely. Genesis 21, 6-7. Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears me will laugh over me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." If you've ever been around a new baby, and I have, and I will again, if you've been with a couple who has struggled to have children, and they have a tiny little son or daughter to call their own, you can appreciate the incredible joy and the celebration of this moment and this time. And it should have been incredible, free from any kind of hint of regret or remorse or drama, except there was a bill coming due. In the ancient world, when infant mortality was common and widespread, they celebrated when a child turned 3 and was weaned from his mother and made it out of that dangerous time. And Abraham threw a celebration for Isaac. And at the party, Sarah saw Abraham's son, Ishmael, laughing. And the implication in the Hebrew language here is that he was making fun of his half-brother Isaac. And Paul would later teach the Galatians that Ishmael persecuted Isaac. Galatians 4:28-29. "You brothers like Isaac are children of a promise," he said. "But just at the time, he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. So also it is now." So Sarah immediately told Abraham he had to cast out Ishmael from their home, and his wife Hagar, and his son who was born of the flesh. Genesis tells us that Abraham was very reluctant to do this. Abraham, it's clear, it's obvious that he loved his son Ishmael, and he recognized that Sarah, who had a hand in creating this mess, was acting irrationally and acting badly toward a child If we kicked boys out of our home for mocking other boys, we would have no boys left at all. And casting Ishmael and his mother into the wilderness to protect Isaac and to please Sarah forced upon Abraham a terrible, terrible choice. The bill came due. They came due, and it must have broken Abraham's heart. How many of us have ever faced a moment like this, where the bill has come due for a previous decision, a previous choice, and we are faced with a terrible decision and choice to make in the present? It's often been said that the safest place to be is right in the middle of the will of God. That, of course, depends upon how you define safe. Safe to do the right thing, but not the easy thing. Safe to do what will glorify God and will grow us in Him, but not safe from pain and heartache. Safe to lay a foundation for the future, but not to resist tearing at the present at the root. And God told Abraham what His will was, and He told him how He would cover the bill coming due. Genesis 21, verses 12 and 13, we are told, God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So the question this morning is, how do we allow Jesus to cover the bill like God did here for Abraham? How do we allow Him to redeem bad decisions, protect us from the worst consequences of our poor choices? The first thing we need to do is we must trust Jesus to provide for what we love. We must trust Him to provide for what we love. Now, one of the most difficult things that we will ever have to do in life is turn something we love over to someone else. The other day, Calvin, age 7, asked if he and his brothers, aged 4 and 3, could take over management of my collection of baseball cards. Painfully assembled 30 years ago, ensconced behind glass and plastic, kept in pristine condition. And I told him, I'm not quite ready for that to happen. And we're just now dropping off our boys at summer camps. A couple weeks ago, I dropped off Calvin in the middle of the woods with a bunch of strangers and kids, and it was not easy to do, and I found myself looking over my shoulder as I walked away to get one last glimpse to make sure that he was okay. And I even had Jen text me when he got home safe and sound that afternoon because I wanted to know. Well, it's hard. It's hard to turn over something that we love to someone else. But this is what God asked Abraham to do with Ishmael. The Lord commanded Abraham to trust Him with his son. When we allow Jesus to redeem our bad decisions and to spare us from the worst of the consequences of our mistakes by trusting Him with the things most dear to us. And this is hard. It's so hard because we want to control things. We want to control even the people who are nearest and dearest to our heart. We want to make sure that they're safe. We want to ensure that they are provided for. Now, some of this, of course, is just sheer responsibility. We're called to be good stewards. But there is a fine line between responsibility and tyranny. Responsibility has its limits. Responsibility realizes that we can't control outcomes. We can only control what we do. That at some point we have to let things go and we have to let people go. Tyranny tries to control the results. It tries to manipulate the process. It tries to hold on tight. And Abraham chose not to be a tyrant. Abraham chose to trust God, and God did not let him down. It had to have been a heartbreaking scene all the way around. Abraham rose up early in the morning, and he gave a skin of water and some bread to Hagar, and she and Ishmael wandered off into the wilderness of Beersheba in the far south of Israel. And it was not long before the water in the skin ran out, and Hagar put Ishmael under a bush and went about a bow shot away, and she believed that she would watch him die. And she began to weep. But God was as good as His word. He heard their cries, and an angel appeared to Hagar and told her that she should fear nothing, and that her son a great nation would also come from him. And the angel said, "Lift up your eyes from the ground and wipe your tears away." And when she did, there was a well there. and she and Ishmael drank from it, and they lived, and he went on to live a long and prosperous life. God paid the bill when Abraham could not. It's a famous story about the church father Augustine, the African theologian, who his mother, who was a Christian, her name was Monica. And she was painfully concerned, and rightfully so, for her son, who experimented with pagan religions and had girlfriends in and out all the time and lived this directionless, pointless life. Monica had a hard time cutting the cord with her son. Even when he was in his 20s, she refused to let him leave home. At the age of 28, he went down to the shore to get on a boat to go to Rome, and his mother, Monica, literally wrapped his body around his and held on. And she said, "You can stay or you can go, but either way, I'm going to be with you, so make up your mind." And he decided to stay, but guess what he did? The next day, he lied to his mother, and he got on a boat in the middle of the night and went to Rome. It was only once Augustine was out of his mother's grasp that he became a Christian, was baptized, was filled with the Holy Spirit, and became one of the great men of the church. See, with all that we love, our work, our success, our dreams, our children, our spouse, our health, even our life, we must eventually turn it over and trust God to provide. Turning it over to God is the admission that He is God and not me. And as tough as it may be, when the bill comes due and we don't have the cash to pay, what other choice do we have? We can go bankrupt, or we can be blessed. The second lesson we learn here is we cannot cling to the flesh of our past. It is destructive to cling to the flesh of our past. Let's go back to Paul's teaching in Galatians here. Abraham had two sons, one that was conceived through the flesh by not trusting God's promise to give him a son and taking matters into his own hands. And he had a son who was conceived, who was born of the Spirit through God's miraculous intervention in His timing and in His purposes. Now, I know to some people, flesh and spirit, those are real churchy words. Well, what do they mean? The flesh simply means something that we achieve, that we receive by our own power, our own hands, for our own purposes, in our own timing. In other words, the flesh is all about me and mine and what I can do. Let me give you an example of this. When I first started preaching, when I was a teenager, and I wanted to do a good job, I would listen to music, loud music in my car on the way to the church. I'd listen to Motown, to AC/DC, Duran Duran, the Ramones, anything to get me pumped up, excited, enthused, filled with energy, to give a high energy, high impact, enthusiastic, dynamic sermon. Well, I don't do that now. I mean, listen to the music. Hopefully the sermons still are, enthusiastic. But now, I get quiet. I pray. I clear out space for the Holy Spirit to fill me. In fact, the very thought of getting pumped up through listening to Tommy Ramone to make me preach makes me a little sick to my stomach, and it sounds ridiculous, as do most acts of the flesh when we gain a little spiritual perspective. I think one of the ways that Jesus redeems us from our bad decisions, that He protects us from the worst of their consequences, is by ruthlessly weeding out the flesh from our life, resulting in those bad decisions. Flesh begets flesh. And Jesus is absolutely ruthless in dealing with the flesh in our life. He is ruthless because He knows that flesh kills. He knows that flesh robs us of our best self, that it degrades our humanity. It makes us into something that scarcely resembles the child of God whom we have been fearfully and wonderfully made to be. Now the question is, of course, where does the flesh come from? Where does the flesh come from? Flesh comes from two places. Flesh is born of pain. Flesh is born of pain. Flesh is unredeemed, lingering pain. Flesh is pain that we cling to. And we cling to it because it gives our life meaning. It helps us feel something. It animates our existence. We cling to pain and we refuse it, and we refuse to give it up because it is easier to define ourselves by our pain than by Jesus' power in our life. I've never seen anyone get so mad when they share their pain and I say to them, well, that's not so bad, is it? People get furious with that kind of thing because we define ourselves by our pain. Flesh is also born of lust. And lust is simply the attitude that what I want, I got to have it now. And I will do whatever I can to obtain it. Think back to Abraham and Sarah wanting to have a son right now rather than being faithful and waiting for God to make good on his promise. Think of Eve, who saw the fruit hanging from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and it was a delight to the eyes, and she wanted to be like God, so she reached out and she took it. Think of David, who saw Bathsheba bathing from his rooftop and immediately sent his men to go bring her to him. Lust is the act of reaching out with our own hand to seize what we should only allow the hand of God to give us. If we want to know the flesh that Jesus wants to ruthlessly rid from our life, there's one question I think we need to ask ourselves. And the question is simply this. It is, where is my stress? Where is my stress? What is that thing that I want so badly, that I want to see so desperately happen in my life, that I spend my waking hours obsessing over it, thinking, wishing, working, willing for it to come to pass? When stress goes unresolved in our life, and it goes unanswered in our life, it comes to dominate. And eventually what happens? Eventually, we don't even want the object that much anymore. We just want the stress gone from our life. We just want the stress to end. But for some reason, we can't quite give it up. We can't quite give it up as much as we might like to give it up. The reason why is once we give our heart over to something, and we make it the center of our life, anything less than Jesus, be it a person, a job, an object, an achievement, an institution, we are simply powerless to stop wanting it. That is something we cannot do by our own strength. We are trapped in the lust of our heart. The thing we have wanted to obtain has instead come to obtain us. And there's only one way out of this. There is only one way out of this, one way out. It is to become obedient to Jesus Christ, to become obedient to Him. Oswald Chambers put it like this. He said, there is no release in human power at all, but only in the redemption. You must yield yourself in utter humiliation to the only one who can break dominating power, the Lord Jesus Christ. There is no doubt that Abraham loved Ishmael. There is no doubt at all. You know, the flesh is never bad things. The flesh is always good things. The flesh is always things that we love. No one ever calls an IRS audit a work of the flesh. No one ever does that. But the only way to overcome the flesh of our past is to be obedient to God in the present. Third and finally, giving up the flesh of the past prepares us for a glorious future. Prepares us for a glorious future. When I was a kid, my parents had some friends from Vietnam. They were our family friends. And they had 7 daughters. And the weddings got expensive. So they had 3 daughters all get married in the same ceremony. And the wedding reception was huge. It was magnificent. I have memories of it to this day. They served a 7-course meal in a Chinese restaurant in Kansas City. And my sister and I sat at the kids' table. My parents sat elsewhere. And before leaving us at the kids' table, my dad said to me, now don't fill up on the appetizers because there is some really good food coming. Well, the appetizers were very, very good. And then the second course, well, that was really good too. And then the third course was just outstanding. And I just kept eating and eating and eating and eating and believing that there was nothing better that could possibly come out of that kitchen. But it just kept coming and coming and coming. And I made myself so sick that by the time the real meal, the really good food arrived, the 4th course, the 5th course, I could not even stand the sight of food. I pushed away from the table. I sat in the corner and held my stomach because I was so nauseous. We have no room. We have no room for Jesus' best. when we fill up on lesser things. Next week, we'll talk about Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac. But Isaac was not the only son Abraham was willing to sacrifice. In a very real way, he sacrificed Ishmael as well, sending him off into the wilderness at God's command. Listen again to these words and think how difficult this must have been. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Could Abraham have possibly taken the steps to obey God's commands to sacrifice Isaac had he been unwilling to be obedient to God's command to send Ishmael into the wilderness? I don't think so. Yet that moment of faith to do the unthinkable, to do the incredible, to trust God completely was the most important act of Abraham's life, and it echoes throughout eternity. It is a clarion call to a people of faith as numerous as the stars in the sky to trust a God who provides. And Abraham's name is synonymous with faith in the one true God because he was willing to trust him with his son. Abraham became all that the Lord had designed him to be, but to do so he had to give up the flesh of his past. And our lives work no differently. No differently. Ultimately, there is a terrible cost. There is an exorbitant bill for clinging to the flesh of the past. And that cost is we can never become the person that Jesus intends for us to be. A few years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine about a crisis potentially quite bad, and we did some things that were unorthodox and normal thinking and tried to follow God's direction and leading and way on it when we really listened to the Lord and tried to follow him exactly and precisely, and it all worked out incredibly well and indeed better than we expected. And as my friend and I discussed it, and I waited for him to congratulate me on being faithful, he instead said something that was less than encouraging. He said, "Get ready for what is coming next. God is just preparing you for something bigger." My friends, Jesus is preparing you. He's preparing you for something bigger than you can imagine. He has covered the bill of the bad mistakes, the poor decisions of the past. Will you go bankrupt paying the bill that has already been paid, or will you allow him to bless you? Amen.